Hello, this will be a video for Dune War of the Spice. It will be focused on units and military. Um, this is not going to be a review. This is intended to help people who've decided they want to play this game and to help them learn the game and provide a way to tackle the many systems that are interacting with each other. So the goal is to line out what mechanics are there, right? There's lots of mechanics. They're all relatively simple, but there's a lot of them. And to provide a roadmap and a prioritization to say like, okay, well, if you want to play this game, focus on these mechanics, then these mechanics, then these mechanics. We're not going to dig into anything faction specific, and we're also not going to dig into air units. Air units, at the time of this video, are exceptionally important in the metagame because they ignore a number of mechanics. But that's also the part that's most in flux. So I don't want to create content that is likely to have a very short shelf life. So let's talk about Dune War for the Spice as it stands compared to some of the other games out there that people want to compare it to. It's a melee infantry centric game, which is important to keep in mind, right? Even though it's set in the future, because of the lore, it is very melee infantry centric. And the planet hates you. It's good to keep that in mind. There is very little randomness in this game. It's good to keep that in mind. There are some things that do have random components, but they're not very frequent. There are relatively few troop options. And unit production is very constrained. Like the number of options you have for increasing your unit production is very, very limited. And the number of units you have access to as a faction is a handful. And what we want to talk about is the 3 tiers of abilities, of mechanics. The first thing I want to cover is armor. Armor is very important. It is probably one of the key things the whole game is based around when it comes to units. Melee versus ranged, how they interact, things you need to keep in mind. Supply, raiding, Shai Hulud, and storms. Then in the more advanced topics, militia, buildings, how a main base works, developments, operations, events, liberation and upkeep. And then for the advanced topics would be mobility, barracks, and veterancy. So let's talk about the basics. These are the things you should be aware of when you're playing the game because they have very large swings in how things end up in the gameplay. First of all, units. There's military units and there's militia. Military units are produced from your main base. They can move around the map. They are expensive, they're powerful. Militia, on the other hand, are produced at villages. They're cheap, dumb, weak, and stick around in the village itself. Right? You can't micro militia. Buildings can be produced at villages. Your main base effectively is a building. They're expensive. They're just as dumb, but they are much more powerful than militia. Unit statistics are relatively simple. You have the damage a unit does per second, and every unit attacks at the same rate. It's 1 attack a second. The armor stat, the health, and the supply. Right? They may have some special rules, but the basic system is there. There's no tags or attributes. Like those things do not exist in Dune as of this video. So, armor. In Dune, the amount of health a unit loses is the damage dealt by the opposing unit minus armor. There are certain things that will modify the percentage damage somebody does. It could be like operations or something like that. But in general, this is what you're looking at. So armor is exceedingly powerful against small hits. If a unit does 6 damage and you have an armor value of 5, you take 1 damage per second from that unit. If a unit hits for 25 damage and you have an armor value of 5, you take 20 damage per second from that unit. Right? It makes a very big difference. For the way that the game then balances out is that there is ways that you can mitigate armor. Heavy infantry or melee infantry are the primary units that have high armor along with buildings. Armor can be damaged. One of the most common rules you'll find is the ability to damage armor, and that gives you a 30% chance to provide a temporary reduction of armor of 1 point. It's not super exciting, but it can have a very major impact, and it's really important when you start talking about buildings. For instance, a turret has an armor value of 10. A main base will have armor values of 20. Most units will not be able to damage a main base in any reasonable capacity until its armor is reduced. Now, the way that armor works is also very important when we start talking about ranged units. In Dune, most ranged units have a rule that says if they're pinned down, they start to do melee attacks. The way you can tell if they're pinned down, there's a little icon, but you can also zoom in, and if you zoom in, you'll see that the unit is doing a different animation. When you're pinned down, your damage drops by 50%. If your damage drops by 50% and armor is in play, you may go from dealing 75% of the damage you normally do, like 5 armor, 20 damage, to doing 10 damage, minus 5 from the armor, or all 5 damage. So you go from 75% damage to 25% damage. It's not that your damage goes down by 50%, your damage may go down by more than that. That particular example, 66%. Ranged units have benefits. You have more DPS uptime, but they need to be shielded. They also need more space. In Dune, you want to fight on the rocks. We'll cover that later. The amount of space on the rocks is limited. If you're fighting and you're not standing on the rocks, you're worm food. Ranged units, in general, are bad on their own. Right? They can be incredibly powerful in support of melee units, but melee units without ranged units is solid. Ranged units without melee units, you're gonna get murdered. They can also damage air units, but they can't counter air units. And the reason for that is that they don't have the mobility to keep up with air units. They don't have the burst damage to really harm air units effectively. Next thing to be aware of is supply. Supply is a system unique to Dune. It pretty much tells you how much resources your troops have. If your troops are outside of your territory, they lose supply. If your supply runs out, your health starts to go down. Supply will recover very quickly if you're near friendly and or occupied towns. And supply limits how far you can go. Right? If you build your first unit and you send it to the enemy base, there's a corpse somewhere in the desert. Right? You're never going to get there. And that's just the way that Dune works. It limits your ability to project force through supply. The idea is it's a harsh planet, so you can't just run across the map and expect that you can operate there with impunity. It takes a lot of effort to get into a position where you can project military force onto your opponent's territory. If you're in deep deserts, It will double your supply drain. So keep that in mind. Also reduce your speed, so that's a double whammy. Some units, like ornithopters, are unaffected by the supply mechanic. Not being affected by the supply mechanics is incredibly powerful. There is a lot of different things in the game that are tied to supply, and you got to ignore all of that. The other thing to be aware of is raiding. In Dune, you can produce resources from your military force. That is relatively unique, but there are expenses to that, right? Because if you use your army, you attack a village, you decide to raid the village, you get resources. But after that, the village will be devastated and it will have additional penalties for a while. You're gonna have to make the decision of like, do you want this village to be part of your empire, or are you effectively mugging this village on a regular scheduled basis? Raiding does allow you to get resupplied. So one of the ways that you would be able to extend your ability to project force is to first raid a village along the way, and then after you raid that village, you can get far enough to get to enemy territory. Later game, you can raid more difficult targets. There are sieges, there are like marauding enemy bands that set up camp. These are relatively difficult targets to attack. They require a decent sized military force, but the rewards are also very high. If you first played the game, you probably ended up picking Atreides, and you probably didn't see the raid button. Atreides doesn't get the raid until you get to later game targets. You can raid enemy villages, but you can't raid neutral villages, and that's just the way the faction is built. After you raid a village, the cost of annexing the village is increased quite a bit. Production in the village is reduced while it's devastated, but it's important to note that buildings are not destroyed. The militia is dead, but the buildings are all fine. And the village is still controlled by whoever controlled it. The last thing to keep in mind is Dune. On the rocks, the worm won't eat you. On the sand, the worm may eat you. If you're fighting on sand, the worm's gonna come eat you. It's very important to keep that in mind. If your opponent has a larger force and it's moving into your territory, if you can engage it and slow it down before it's able to reach onto the rocks, they may all die. It makes territory very valuable. It makes being on rocks a very important part, and one of the things to keep in mind with microing is making sure that you don't have troops sitting on the sand. You do get a short notice before your units are just gone. There's a little exclamation mark next to the units that are in danger. But if you're not paying attention, they're just going to be gone. It's just better to be safe than sorry in this case. Storms are far more random. They can strike anywhere. They're very slow. They're relatively big. And you can kind of predict the path they're taking. You can outrun a storm. But if outrunning a storm means you have to run into the deep desert, you might still die. Storms are probably one of the most random, high impact events in the game. It can shut down a military offensive. And that wraps up the basic mechanics. Right? If you keep these things in mind, you're going to have a much better time. And if you focus on this perspective of the game, you're going to have an easier time understanding how and why certain battles ended up going one way or another. Now let's talk about the next part. And these are things that you want to be aware of when you're intending to win through military victory. First of all, militias. They're cheap and they're dumb. they can be microed, right? If you're attacking an enemy village, and even if that village has a bunch of militias, you can predict how the behavior of those militias is the same way that a neutral village militia is. Right, so if you send one melee infantry unit to the far side of the village and you attack it, all the ranged troop will be as far away as possible from that melee unit, which might place it closer to the rest of your army. Right, so militias are useful. They work well against NPC elements in the game, right? So like raiding Fremen, raiding Marauders, or anything like that. Militias will do a great job, up to a point, because they're not super powerful. But against players, they will know and be able to exploit the militia AI, and there's nothing you can do to counter it. So the only thing you really can hope for is that your militias are going to slow them down enough for your actual real military to come help out. On the same token, if you get good at exploiting NPC militias, you're going to get good at exploiting actual player towns as well. You're going to have an easier time dealing with their militias. You're going to spend less resources on it. You will spend less time with the town being active, and your opponent has less time to respond militarily before you start your looting, pillaging, liberating, annexation, whatever you want to do with the town. Buildings. There's a couple of buildings of note. First of all, command post. 20% more power to this and adjacent regions. This is it's a very big boost. 20% is the larger boost. Most of the things that we're talking about in this range is going to be like 20% effects, whereas in the previous topic, most of the things in there can have a 50% effect, or, you know, whether or not you live or die type of effect. So command post, very valuable, but expensive. It has a lot of upkeep. You don't necessarily want to have every region affected by a command post. Missile batteries. Missile batteries are dumb. They're NPC units. You can't micro them. They deal 50 damage, which is twice that of a unit. They can reduce armor. They do area of effect damage. They have 10 armor and they have 500 health. They are susceptible to some operations. This is an incredibly powerful thing while it's shooting. As soon as there's no friendly troop in the village, you can start the pillaging, the liberation, whatever you want to do. It's occupied. It stops shooting. The way you get it to shoot again is to first remove the enemy's presence out of there. Right? Running more troops in is not going to, it's going to stop the liberation or whatever operation or whatever action people chose. But it's not going to start it to fire again. You're going to have to retake the village. This is why understanding how to quickly and easily dispatch militias is very valuable, because you take much less damage from missile batteries. Oh, missile batteries are not going to shoot until the village is actually getting attacked. Right? This is a little bit unique, and if you're experienced with other games, incredibly frustrating. But unless there's actual attacks in progress, it doesn't just start firing outside of your controlled region or anything like that. There are some limitations to how much your missile battery is going to just be shooting stuff. Placing missile batteries next to enemy villages, you can have missile batteries standing right next to each other and nothing's going on until people actually cross the border. Main base. Also dumb. This is very important to keep in mind. It has 20 armor, has 20,000 health, it does 80 damage, area of effect damage, and it's susceptible to certain votes and operations. Um, you can micro a main base, right? You can counter it against, you can, well, you can't micro the main base, but you can use micro to reduce the amount of damage a main base does. You send in a decoy unit, the decoy unit is getting shot, and at the meantime you're working on reducing that 20 armor to 0. Once the 20 armor reduces down to 0, that's when you start to hit it with your main force. By doing this, the amount of damage you do is going to be drastically more. And for your opponents, it's very difficult because they're just watching their main base shoot something for a little while, and then it runs away, and then starts shooting something else, which immediately just starts making sure that there's no splash damage, making sure that the damage to the rest of the army is minimal. Your main base looks really good on paper. In practice, once you actually get sieged and your armor is reduced to 0, it can go south very quickly. And that's before operations and votes, which can make it go much faster. But the first time you encounter it, if you're not aware on how the armor mechanic works, it will be completely unscathed and your army will be dead. Development. Developments have two parts that are important to them. One, it unlocks main buildings. Right? Main base buildings will allow you to increase your military power. It unlocks certain units, also a very big benefit of developments. And otherwise it tends to be mostly numerical adjustments or increases in command points. From what you've learned up to this point, most of the developments will be easy to read and you'll be able to understand what the development means in relationship to the mechanics that we've covered so far. If you have no developments and somebody has all the developments, then the person with the bigger force and the better unit composition is going to win. Right? Developments are not going to allow you to mitigate keeping an eye on unit composition. If you build your best unit and your opponent looks at it and they have not all these developments, but they can deal with them, and everybody's best unit tends to be melee infantry, and they have counter armor capabilities and you don't, it might not go well. It probably won't go well. Right, so it's important to keep in mind that the developments will allow the better player to win. So if both players are equally skilled, the one with the more developments is definitely gonna get out on top. If both forces are the same size or equally matched, the developments can absolutely make the difference. It is not that you have the developments, your opponent does not, so therefore you're going to walk all over them. Right? That's not how powerful the developments are. That's not necessarily true for other parts of Dune, but for the military part, the basic infantry you're handed, like your first option that you can build, is a really solid unit. Right, operations. Operations can be quite powerful. Again, 20%-ish is the ballpark of how much power they produce. It can increase power or reduce power, reduce speed, can sometimes increase armor, regenerate supply, regenerate health. But that's what happens with operations. Learning how to deploy operations can make the difference, but it's like in the 20% range difference. It's not in the, oh god, we won because I missed this operations. Like there's some where like the Fremen can summon a worm bad, but that also meant you ignored the part about standing on rocks first. So they can be powerful, they can make the difference. they're not incredibly important as compared to the original topics. And if you want to focus on the advancements in the military tree over paying attention to operations, that is a perfectly valid strategy. Doing both is better, but either one will give a similar-ish payout. Events. So military units can sometimes investigate events on the map. It is important to keep in mind that for military to investigate events, you do not need to control the region or its neighbors to have military investigate the events. This is different than like having spies investigate events or point of interest. So military can get in a little bit deeper, and it can, possibly steal your opponent's events that they were keeping around. Because it's important to keep in mind an event can be investigated once, and events are shared. The events you see and the events your opponents see, they're out of the same pool. If you complete an event that your opponent knows about, then that means that event is now gone for them as well. The rewards are not necessarily the same. Right? Your faction may dictate the rewards, your faction may dictate the options. But the icon, I believe, is the same. It's important to keep in mind that when you are completing events, you are burning supply. They're usually not on the rocks. They're usually on the sand. So if you are running out of your region and you're then completing an event, which takes time, not very long compared to an agent, but it does take time, then you have to make sure that you can get back onto your own territory to stop the supply drain. So there's limitations to how far you can go to collect these events without losing your troops. Liberation. So we've talked about raiding, and you've seen annexation because the game pretty much forces you to do that. Liberation makes an enemy village neutral. One of the important things to keep in mind is it destroys all the buildings there. Right? If you raid a village, all the buildings stay there. If you liberate a village, all the buildings go poof. After it becomes a neutral village, it can be raided. So you could liberate and then raid, or you might liberate and your buddy may raid after that if you play multiplayer. Upkeep. Military has an upkeep. Solaris, manpower, water, command points, sometimes battery, depending on what you play. For command points come from your main base buildings. It comes from advancements. It is the nice thing to keep in mind is that if you have a large military and it gets wiped out, your resource production goes through the roof because your upkeep just went down. Right, so there's a little bit of a combat mechanic in that regard. It's also important to keep in mind that if you have a large military and it's not doing anything for you, and your opponent doesn't have a large military, well, then their economy is better because they don't have to support a large military. So your army is encouraged to be utilized. Alright. Being aware of those things will allow you to do pretty well and have military victories, take down main bases, and it covers most of the mechanics that are worth being aware of to be able to start playing against hard AI and have fun with that. So there's more systems in this game. These are much more niche than the other ones. Alright, mobility. So if you're not playing Fremen, Then you can build airfields. Troops can move from one airfield to another. It's a small fee. It's pretty cheap to move them around. Airfields are expensive to maintain. That's where the real cost comes in. And main bases count as having an airfield. Airfields can be essential in being able to lay siege and reinforce a siege. It can be very valuable, but that also means that you had to capture a region close to the enemy. You had to then build an airfield. You probably also built a military outpost. At that point, you've already had to lay siege to the territory for quite a while. Fremen can't build airfields. They have their own unique mechanic. But it's important to keep in mind that if you do not build airfields, well, you're not paying the upkeep on these things, right? You're not investing the building slots. You're not paying the upkeep. You can spend those resources instead on more troops and have your force be better distributed. It can make the difference in a lot of cases, but if you do not have a very spread out empire, it might not actually make much of a difference. Barracks. So one of the buildings you can build is called the barracks. You first need to get advancements, like you have to red research item trees. That allows you to create a building. That building can go into your main base. That thing is called a barracks. And now on the right of your screen, there's a button above the roster of all your military units that's called barracks. If you go in there, your different unit types have options that you can apply to them. It's 2 modifications per unit. Applying the modification is a one-time cost. But it's important to keep in mind that these things are not really upgrades. They're more like side grades, right? More power, but also more upkeep. More supply, but also less armor. There's a bonus and there's a drawback. You can win militarily without ever looking at the screen. But, utilizing it properly does allow you to do nifty things. It might give you enough supply to be able to set up a forward base far enough behind enemy lines to be able to lay siege to their capital. Right? It can allow for certain plays if you utilize it well. But in general, you can skip this until you get to the point where you want to do the fancy stuff. Veterancy. Because why not? There's 3 levels of veterancy. It takes 100 experience for level 1, 200 experience for level 2, 300 experience for level 3. So 600 experience total to level all the way up. Killing a militia gives 7 experience to each combatant. Right? So you have a whole bunch of people beating one militia, and a whole bunch of people all get 7 experience. One person beats the militia, they get 7 experience. So you can farm experience if you are so inclined. Veterancy adds a little bit of damage, a little bit of health, a little bit of supply. You can completely ignore this mechanic unless you really need that extra little edge. Right? It doesn't increase your armor. If it increased armor, I will bounce veterancy up in importance, but right now it is just, think of it as one more thing that you can safely ignore. Alright, that wraps up all the different parts that are the mechanics involved in units. It kind of gives you a roadmap on what to focus on, what parts are worth looking at, what parts are not worth looking at, and gives you a way to eat the elephant. Because as it stands, Dune is very much an elephant. There's a lot of different systems, and those different systems make vastly different impacts on how the game plays. right? If you have a army where everybody is walking in with a rifle and you're having a battle on sand, it doesn't matter how much supply you have, you're gonna get murdered. Possibly by your opponent, possibly by the planet, doesn't matter. Right? You need to make sure you know what the basics are. Once you get comfortable with the basics, you can start looking at the advanced stuff. One of the things that you probably noticed from the basics is that building a melee unit and a ranged unit at the beginning of the game, which seems like it would be a good idea, might not be a good idea. Just build 2 melee units. It's safer, it's easier, it requires less micro, it requires less space. They're less likely to start fighting while standing on sand. Now, once you have 4 or 5 melee units, and the ability for people to attack each other becomes a limiting factor, having ranged units added in makes a very big difference. But until you get there, it's just melee units are great. Once you get to the point where you're comfortable with those basics, then you can start just tackling 1 or 2 of the more intermediate topics. Get comfortable with those. If you run out of things to learn, you can start focusing on some of the advanced topics. But the payoff for learning the advanced topics is not as big as for the medium topics, right? And the medium topics are nowhere near as important as the basic topics. All right,